The last couple months of reading have really been a mixed bag. We've had a DNF, I've had some new favourites, it's really been all over the place. So as we are moving into quarter 3 of the year, let's look back at everything I read in quarter 2. First up, we have Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb, the second book in the Farseer trilogy. I did do a spoiler-filled video on this, but let's get into some spoiler-free thoughts. I loved it. It was great. It was really good. I really enjoyed Assassin's Apprentice, and I went into this with really high hopes because I loved the first book, and everybody says that the series, the second book is probably the strongest one. So I went in thinking I'm going to enjoy this even more, and I think I did overall. I'll never get over the ending of Assassin's Apprentice. It was just such a good ending for a book. Good is maybe a strong word. It was an impactful ending. But I do think The Royal Assassin is the stronger book. But Robin Hobb's prose just pulls you into this story, into her character work, with not only Fitz but all the side characters, just draws you so into the world. And it is a pretty long book, and it is very... People call it slow-paced, but I would say it's not slow-paced in that a lot happens. And there's so many small subplots and side stories, and we get a lot of details for the side characters. But there is a lot of sort of day-to-day antics of following Fitz as he goes about his day, and we get a lot of these side plots and such, which does make the overarching story feel slower. But I'm not sure I would call it a slow-paced story, which I think might be a hot take. But I have heard that Assassin's Quest is a slower story with a lot of traveling sequences and such, and this is properly slow paced. So we'll see when I get there, which it will come up later in the video, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I love following Fitz's story, and I think it really gets even more complicated as a character through this, and some of his relationships with these side characters. Super interesting. Burek is such a cool character. I love him, he's great. Even Lady Patience, who's a pretty minor side character, but we get a lot more of her backstory in this, and it is the way that Hobb can pull on your heartstrings with side character plots. It's just such a small part of this story, but she still manages to put so much impact and emotional gut punching in these small elements. It's so good. It's so good. We also get a lot more of the world building in this. We learn some more about the Out-Islanders, not Outislanders, as I like to call them in the spoiler videos. We get some more info about the Fool. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed the sort of chapter or passage where we learned a little bit more about him. And I really hope we get more of him in the future in Assassin's Quest and also in the future trilogies. And the overall name of the story, Realm of the Elderlings, is starting to play a part in the narrative, which is really fun. So we do get lots of like bits of world building sprinkled throughout, despite the fact that this is a very character-driven story. And the ending. The ending is insane. There is so much going on there that has so much potential and implications for this story that has me very excited to continue into Assassin's Quest. And this isn't a spoiler because he's set up to suck from the start, but Regal, I hate Regal so much. There's no redeeming qualities for him as a person. I hate him so much. He's awful. He's just one of those easily hated characters. Hate him. This has become a new favorite series of all time. I love Robin Hobb's writing, so immersive. I could sit and read her prose all day. In fact, this is joint first as my favourite book of the year with Dungeon Crawler Carl Book 6, which I understand is a weird mix. I think I had a comment from Esme about, I really like your range as a reader, talking about Dungeon Crawler Carl, this satirical, over-the-top, silly, bizarre fantasy sci-fi book, and then heart-wrenching, emotional, medieval fantasy style, classic fantasy Robin Hobb book. It's quite a strange two things to have, but they're definitely both my favourite reads of the year so far, for completely different reasons, but they're both so good. Next up is a bit of a self-plug, because Goodreads says that I read this next. Silence is Silver by me. Now, in the last 3 months, I did proofread this several times, edit it, and also release this. This is a fantasy novella that I like. Yeah, that was pretty good. It is the origin story for a side character in the main trilogy called Bass. Now, he is part of the Ardal, which is this sort of subculture in the world. And this subculture live under the sands in these tunnels, and they have a very specific way of living that's rather strange. They're very almost cult-like in their society. They strive to be strong, and they're constantly training and meditating. It is a very monk-like culture. I have taken pieces from places like Buddhism and things like that, but then ramped it up to 1,000,000 times and mixed it in with a bunch of other stuff as well. So I'm really pleased with it. Someone described it as the sort of origin story for the Fremen in June, which isn't something that I thought of while I was writing it, but I really like that comparison. I think it's quite a good idea for the tone and the setup of this novella. So you can read this completely for free by signing up for my newsletter, and I'm also doing a giveaway for a signed and numbered hard copy. I sold 50 signed and numbered copies, but I kept behind the first one, so 1 out of 50, to do as a giveaway. So if you want a chance to win that, then you can do just by signing up for my mailing list in the description below, and I will pick out a winner next week. And also, if you sign up, you'll get the ebook for free anyway, so sign up for a free ebook. Next on up, we have The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. Now, I've already talked about this in other videos because of how much fun I had with this book. Is definitely a new favorite, and I'd be surprised if this wasn't in the top 10 for the year as well. This is a murder mystery fantasy with sort of a biological mutagenic like magic system where you can get different classes of people who have certain abilities. And we follow an investigator called Din. Now, he is a sort of assistant to this woman called Anna Delabra, and she's very much like the Sherlock Holmes character. She is the detective, and she's very quirky and witty and just a wee bit out there and rather strange. I loved her so much. She was a great character. Just the way that she talks and interacts with other characters was always entertaining to read. But Din is the main perspective, and he's the one going around investigating the different parts of this mystery. So he's called to the scene where a man has been torn apart with a tree growing through him. And he's dead, obviously. And Din needs to figure out what happened. And Din is one of these different classifications of people. He's called an engraver, which means he can remember everything vividly as long as he has a scent. So engravers carry around these jars, and then if they want to remember everything, they open it, smell a scent, take everything in, and then they can tie all what they saw and heard to this smell. And also in this world, they have a wet season where it rains a lot, and they live behind this huge wall that gets attacked by these massive leviathans whenever the wet season comes around. It sounds insane, but there's just so much to this story. It's like Attack on Titan meets Sherlock Holmes with epic fantasy, all wrapped up in this murder mystery story. It's fast-paced, and it's a really fun mystery to watch unravel. And then it sent me spiraling into wanting to read lots of fantasy murder mysteries. I loved it that much. So I highly, highly recommend checking out The Tainted Cup. It was one of my favorite reads of the year so far. And I need the sequel yesterday. Also, I do want to note that the audiobook for The Tainted Cup is fantastic. I jumped between the audiobook and the physical, and it was great. So if you like audiobooks, highly recommend the audiobook. Next up was my DNF, which was Kraken Rider Z. Now I did put this down as my biggest disappointment this year so far in my mid-year freakout tag video, but I want to reiterate that it's not a bad book. It's just not what I was hoping it was going to be. It wasn't the type of read I wanted to read when I started listening to the audiobook. I will say the audiobook narrator did a really good job. So if you want to check this out, the audiobook is great. The premise is that it's a dragon rider-like fantasy with krakens. It just sounds sick, and the cover's awesome. I was so excited for this book, and its progression fantasy had me really excited as well. I love Dungeon Crawler Carl, looking to read more like it. So I was so excited to jump into Kraken Rider Z, And when I got into it, I started reading it, and it was a good opening. Slow and very standard, but I'm here for a chosen one like story, and we follow Z as he stumbles across this strange creature, which is pretty obviously the Kraken. I'm not going to try and hide that from you because it's pretty obvious from the start. But my problem with this story is I read the first 20-25% maybe. It was a good number of hours into the audiobook, and it just felt so predictable and standard and quite young. I would say this book definitely has a YA feel to it, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just not what I was hoping for or expecting going into it. And it felt very standard. Even in the first chunk of the book, I don't feel like I learned that much about the world. It just felt like really long, drawn out setup. I could sum up the several hours of the audiobook in a couple sentences, which I don't want to do because it would spoil it if people do want to read it, but it is very just simple, for a better word. There wasn't really that much to the main character. He was fairly 2D. I don't feel like we got very much of the world building, other than we know that mer people exist and also krakens exist, which is really cool, and I don't need a big info dump, but I just felt like there wasn't really anything to grab onto. If I got either a really deep main character, perfect, or if I got really interesting world building to grab onto, I'd be perfect. I want to know more about this, but I just didn't feel hooked into the story. I will say I stopped right at the part where I think it's probably going to get interesting. We do have Z moving into the next leg of the story, but I just wasn't interested. I might go back to it because I do think there's a lot of potential in the story and it sounds really interesting, but it might just not be for me. However, I will say the authors are awesome people and I'm really excited to check out their other work. Both of them have books that I really, really want to read. I do think that this is just a wrong book, wrong time situation. It is very young and simple and it's just not what I'm in the mood for right now. However, if I'm ever looking for something like that, I may go back to this book because it was definitely not a bad book. It just wasn't for me right now. Again, I might go back to it because Kraken Rider Z just sounds cool. I want to love it. Next up, I read The Silverblood Promise by James Logan. Now, this is also a murder mystery. I didn't know it at the time, but when I got into the story, I was so glad because I love murder mysteries now after the Tainted Cup. You'll find out there might be another one on this list as well. I love them. They're so good. And this book opens with Lucan, a noble that has left his family and is out in the world by himself for unknown reasons at the start that I won't spoil. And he gets news that his father is dead. And not only that, but he has been murdered. And with his dying breath, he wrote out Lucan's name, the name of a city, and another name that we don't know. So Lucan goes on this adventure to figure out what this city and what this name was and why his father thought he needed to write this down before he died. There are two things I loved about this book in particular. The first one is the character Lucan himself. He is your witty, snarky main character who just is really funny, especially with his dialogue. I think the dialogue in this book is terrific, especially with Lucan, and just the way he snaps back at people and the conversations he has with some of the antagonists as well as the friend side characters was always really good fun to read. Just the wit and the banter, always a good time. The second thing was the description work. Just the city of Sophrona and some of the really unique world-building aspects were written out so vividly and well. You could really see the city, you could really hear the sounds, smell it. It was incredibly visual writing. There was some repetition in the story where Lucan went out and did some things and then returned to a side character and then just retold and recapped what he just did. And these just felt a little unnecessary and could have been cut or just fade to black and then Lucan caught this person up type thing instead of having to recap everything. However, it's a pretty minor point. And I loved the different world building in this book. There is this lost race called the Faerun, and there's Faerun relics, which is like unexplained, not understood technologies that the Faerun used to have, that these people now scavenge this wasteland for. Just wait until you meet Flea. The dynamic between Flea and Lucan is so wholesome, and I loved her as a character. She's the best, and she better be fine. If anything happens to Flea, I'm burning your books, James. It's just gonna happen. Not happy. So if you're looking for some great character work, great world building in this brand new fantasy epic, definitely check out the Silverblood Promise. And it's got murder mystery in it. You can't go wrong with the murder mystery in it. And I say it every time, but look at the cover. Look at the cover by James Brown. It's so beautiful. He did such a good job, and I cannot wait to see what they do with the cover for book 2. It is absolutely stunning. And next on up we have Murder at Spindle Manor by Morgan Stang, which is another fantasy murder mystery. Yes! This was the book club pick for June, which I was so happy about because I wanted more murder mysteries after reading the Tainted Cup and Silverblood Promise and having a really good time. But it was voted in. I didn't just say, we're reading this. It was voted in by more than just me. This was the SBFBO winner for last year, and I can see why, because it is a fantastic self-published book. The best way to describe this book is just fun. Someone in the Discord compared it to Knives Out, and I definitely see that comparison. In this book, we follow Isabeau, who is a monster hunter, and she tracked down this parasitic monster who can take control of people's bodies and retain all their memories and just recreate them, all the way to this inn called Spindle Manor. And within this manor, there is a large cast of 10 different characters, each with their own backstories, but they are all one party. And Isabeau sets about trying to figure out which one is the parasite monster. However, things get even more complicated when one of the 10 die. Now stuck with this parasitic monster, this horrible storm that's keeping them within the manor, and this murder, Isabeau sets out to figure out who the killer is and who the monster is before the storm passes and they can leave and escape into the city. I was a little worried at the start because it does introduce the 10 characters very quickly, and I thought, am I going to have to remember all this? Because there's a lot of information very quickly at the start. However, you don't, and it does all come very naturally after that. In delving into each of the characters and what they were doing there and their backstory and how they tie to the different characters in the party was one of my favorite elements of the story, just learning more about them. And there's some really funny characters. Mr. Holmes, which is definitely a play on Sherlock Holmes, is this drunk coachman and he's great. I loved him, and I loved Isabeau piecing together all these different clues, and we got to visit different parts of the manor and kind of delve a wee bit into its history. And it is a very short book, and it is very fast paced. There isn't a ton of description work or anything like that, but I think it flowed really well as a fast paced murder mystery. Super fun read, and I really am excited to continue into the sequels. Book 3 just came out this month, and book 2 is already out as well. Why would book 3 be coming out and book 2 wasn't? You get what I mean. There's another 2 books out, and I cannot wait to continue following Isabeau in this world. Because that was the other thing that surprised me with not only this, but also Tainted Cup and Silverblood Promise, is how much world building that they're able to include in this story when it might not even be a main focus of the story. And the world in Spindle Manor was really interesting. Just the touches of different magic and strange setting details, such as at night, they have these creatures called will-o-wisps hover about the forests and dark places. And we don't really know that much about them, but people don't go near them. So I really hope we get more information about that in the future books. But after the end of this as well, the ending was really strong, and it did a really good job of setting up sort of the series and continuing on with further mysteries. Really excited to continue on with this. Also, I couldn't quite finish it in time, but I am currently reading 2 books. The first of which is Spin of Fate. Now, I'm really mad I didn't finish this in time for this video, but I'll just give you some initial thoughts. I'm having a really good time with this book. It is YA. and it does have some of the YA-isms that I'm not a huge fan of. Some parts can be pretty fast-paced when I really want it to be a wee bit more fleshed out, and some of the characters can act a little young for my personal taste. However, I do really enjoy the characters. I think the world is fascinating. It has this sort of karmic law. It's called tyrannic law in the book, where there are 4 different realms, and depending on how good you are as a person, you can either ascend into a higher realm or descend into one of the lower realms, and the 2 bottom are like these awful hellscapes, and these higher realms are lovely and glorious and happy. So it's very interesting world to have this sort of inbuilt karma in society, and this sort of hierarchy tied to the magic system is very interesting. And the second book I'm currently reading is, of course, Assassin's Quest. Now, I'm right at the start. There isn't a whole lot I can say, but I will do a spoiler-filled video, just as I did for the first 2 books, and then a spoiler-free review in the next wrap-up. But it's a great start. Love it. Love Fitz. Love to see the implications of where the second book ended, and just this slow start into the story, but it makes complete sense for the narrative. Loving it. As for writing, one of the reasons why I didn't read as much this quarter as last quarter is because this was a pretty heavy writing part of the year. I did a pass and a proofread and all the logistical parts of piecing together this novella release. And I also finished the first draft for book 2 of the Shadowbinders trilogy. The first being Harbinger of Justice, and I have just finished the first draft of The Black Mantle, which is book 2. But not only that, I have already jumped into draft 2, so I'm really looking forward to making some legway into the next draft. It is sitting at 152,000 words. It will likely go up a little bit, but hopefully not too much. The first book was about 125,000 words, so it's a little bit longer than the first one, but I am super pleased and proud of it, even with just the first draft, so I cannot wait to get the story and be able to share it with everybody. Don't have any news for release dates yet. I kind of want to get a better feel for the edits and get some other eyes on it apart from my own before I start putting dates down. So I'm not sure when this will release, but hopefully I'll have more things to share in the coming months. As for a sort of channel wrap up, we did slow down a wee bit with production of videos down to 1 a week for the last wee while, just because it's been so heavy with the writing and some other behind the scenes stuff. I did say I was going to release 2 new video series. They both didn't happen this quarter, but I'm hoping at least one of them will happen next quarter, because both of them are a wee bit more production value, and I need another set of hands for one, and I need to buy props and equipment for one, so there's a wee bit more to them, but I'm hoping that 1 will get back up to 2 videos, 2, I'll be able to get one of those new series out very, very soon. I also did a fair bit of collaborations with live shows and interviews and a cameo in the Library of Viking video, so if you want to see more of me for some reason, there's definitely more out there that I did recently. I always find these chats a ton of fun, and it's great to be able to chat with more people than just myself and a camera, because the camera doesn't talk back. In the next video, I will be doing my TBR for quarter 3 of the year. I have a very specific TBR for this next quarter of the year, and I'll tell you why in that video, but it should be a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to it. So thank you very much for watching. Outro. Whoop.